Yes, hello to you all once again, and another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And once again, thanks for all of your positive comments that you've been leaving on my video postings. It does take quite a bit of effort and work on my behalf, and not to mention, of course, the travelling to go and film the bikes, but it's nice to know that you're enjoying my video content. So right now we're going to continue with our series of looking at those little 125 liquid and air-cooled motocross machines. So let's dive straight into our next video and take a look at part 2. Right, so let's get cracking with part 2 of our series looking at classic air and liquid cooled 125s, and first up, it's a beautiful example of what was Suzuki's first ever liquid-cooled motocrosser, and this is their pretty awesome 1981 RM125. Now, although this example here looks for all the world like it's an unmolested machine from that mega 1980s era, this is actually a bike that underwent a full restoration some years ago, but nevertheless it's still a cracking looking version of one of these iconic milestones in Suzuki's history. Because I'm sure that you're already aware that 1981 was the year that Suzuki ditched their old air-cooled motocross motors and then made the transition to a much more modern liquid-cooled power plant. And even although this 81 bike was a brand new design from the previous twin shock bike of 1980, there was very little to dislike about this new Suzuki racer, and it appeared that Suzuki had got their sums absolutely spot on first time out. But this superb water-cooled reed valve 6-speed Suzuki engine was just a peach of a motor, fueled of course by a 32mm Mikuni carburetor and a modern CDI electronic ignition system to supply all the sparks. But essentially this engine in 1981 was a motocross template for many other manufacturers to follow in the years to come, and as long as you were prepared to keep your left foot dancing up and down on that transmission shifter, then this little rocket ship of an engine could certainly propel you down the track at a decent rate of knots. And as I said, for Suzuki's first time effort at manufacturing a liquid-cooled motocross motor, this compact power plant certainly ticked all of the boxes in terms of its performance and engine reliability. Now, up at the front end of our RM125 we had a pair of Kayaba 38mm front forks, which for 1981 were just about as good as you could expect on a lightweight 125, although if you were prepared to experiment with different spring rates and maybe different weights of oil, you could certainly improve on the performance of these front suspension units. Now, there was more innovation for Suzuki in 1981, as this was also the very first year of their superb full floater rear suspension unit, which was so called because that single rear monoshock wasn't bolted directly onto the frame and the swing arm, but it used a pair of linkages on both the top and on the bottom to remotely connect it to the chassis and the swing arm, which of course reputedly gave the bike that full floating effect at the rear. And once again, a plastic fuel tank for 1981 that, as I remember, I think it held just over 1.5 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, which was usually more than enough to keep our little 125 motor fed with its fuel. But as you can see, this was a custom made fuel tank for this 1981 bike, with this deliberate cutaway provided underneath this left-hand side to accommodate the remote gas and oil reservoir for that rear single monoshock. But surprisingly, it was just a large single radiator that was used on our RM 125 in 81 that was quite easily fillable from the bike's right hand side, and it also had a couple of these plastic air scoops as well, just to help direct that oncoming air into the cooling system. But certainly riders who raced these bikes back in the days had very few complaints about these very quick little 125 screamers, because usually pilots of 125 bikes always seem to want more power from their smaller engines, or even better handling from their bike's chassis. But even straight right out of the crate, these were still highly competitive bikes in that year, and this featured example is certainly a little trip down memory lane to a time when Suzuki shifted from the old air-cooled twin-shock bikes to what was now to become the industry standard for many years to follow. Okay, so our next classic 125 is Kevin Lee's 1980 YZ125. Again, another very fine example of one of these smaller YZs. Not 100% original bike, of course, as it does have a few non-stock parts bolted onto it, like maybe a replacement exhaust expansion chamber and a new set of wheels, but nevertheless, another cracking looking bike just the same. And once more, this little YZ125 motor was just about what you'd come to expect from the Japanese motorcycle Yamaha factory. Good engineering and a compact and powerful two-stroke 6-pedal reed valve induction motor. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure that Yamaha used magnesium engine casings on this motor, which certainly made it feather light in terms of its overall weight, but as with most other 125s of its time, it had a 6-speed gearbox as well. So once again, another compact and powerful little power plant. So up at the front end, again decent forks for a 125 lightweight motocrossers, which I think were 38mm stanchions, which I think gave the rider almost 12 inches of travel here at the front end. Now, for stopping or slowing down our zippy little YZ, we still had the stock drum brakes here at the front and also at the rear. And as I said, Kevin's bike has had brand new wheels to replace what would have been probably a pair of nice silver alloy units in 1980. But at the back end of our Yamaha, it was a single monoshock that ran along the backbone of the bike, where it then bolted onto the Yamaha Motocross swing arm, which again was a very tough, tried and tested system that not only worked well on these smaller capacity bikes, but also on the bigger YZs as well, including the mighty YZ465 of that same year. And as you can see, Kevin's Yamaha here is decked out in the European white and red livery, whereas if you had one of these YZs over in the USA or some other international country, then you probably would have had your particular YZ decked out in the alternative yellow and black livery. And as I said, another striking example of one of these great bikes, which as you can see is still being put to good use as a race bike by Kevin. And although Kevin's 125 Steeds, not factory original. It doesn't really matter because it's more important that these old school vintage dirt bikes get kept on the track where of course they belong. Okay, so we're going back to the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show now to check out our next 125, and this time it's the turn of Simon Chamberlain and his lovely looking 1979 KX 125 Kawasaki. Now Simon's Quacker was one of a nice collection of bikes that were on display at the air-cooled 125 Championship stand at the show, and hopefully we'll manage to feature a couple more examples from here as we go through this series. Now again, there's certainly something about the look of these KXs from that period. I think it could be the combination of that Kawasaki green and the use of those gold coloured wheels and that lovely swing arm that give these machines a look unlike any other Japanese manufactured bike. But another potent Japanese 125 two-stroke motor here with reed valve induction that was fed again through a 32mm Mikuni carburetor, and this also had a 6-speed transmission and electronic CDI ignition to provide the sparks. But back in the day, these little Kawasaki engines were pushing out around the 22 horsepower mark, which was pretty good for a small, tightly packed two-stroke. And again, the little Kawasaki's front forks were decent performers, like of course most of the other big three Japanese bikes of their day, and it was around 9 inches of travel that you had to work with here at this front end. But certainly no surprise that Simon's swapped the 1979 original rear shocks for something a bit more substantial, like these lovely gas-filled piggyback units. But once more, this is a 40-plus-year-old dirt bike, so you have to expect a few non-stock parts bolted onto it. Of course, one of the main features on these Kawasaki's from 1979 was this gold coloured rear swing arm, which to me seemed to be the perfect colour combination to go with the green plastics on the bike. But with regards the brakes, I'm pretty sure that this front hub had a magnesium backplate with an alloy brake drum, which also had quite decent stopping power for such a small size of drum. Although the rear hub and brake backplate were both made from magnesium, as I remember, and this was all just to try and keep the overall weight of the bike to a decent level, which, as I recall, was around the 190 pound mark with half a tank of fuel on board, which of course made it one of the lightest of the Motocross 125 bikes in that particular year. Although whether Simon's KX here is 100% original or not, it's still nice to see one in the flesh again, so to speak, because these 125 Kawasaki's and even its bigger brother, the mighty 250, were certainly both excellent race bikes in their day, and it's guys like Simon and many others that you have to applaud for keeping these nostalgic twin shockers out there racing on the tracks. Okay, so next up, another very rare motorcycle, and this is Terry Pickering's 1980 Italian Aprilia 125 MX, and this is just one of a few bikes that we're going to feature from Terry's collection as we go through this classic 125 series. Now, for those of you who aren't regular visitors to my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, you might immediately think that this old 1980 bike has just recently undergone some refurbishment or even a full restoration recently, but in actual fact, this bike here is a brand new and unused machine from 1980. And so this bike here was bought by Terry some years ago from a private collector in Belgium who had this bike and many more unused machines from the 1980s, all tucked away in his air-conditioned warehouse, which is the reason why this bike looks like it's just come straight off the Aprilia production line. Now, Aprilia in 1980 never really had a power plant of their own that they could use in their motocrossers because Aprilia's main focus at that time was on road and road racing bikes in the early 1980s, and so they used this supplier engine that was made by Hyro in Italy. And just to endorse that fact that this is a brand new and unused bike from that era, this Hyro motor has never even been kicked over or even had a single drop of fuel poured into its fuel tank. And so as brand new vintage dirt bike motorcycles go, this is just about as good and as rare as it gets. But this 125 Italian Hyro motor was without doubt a good little engine that was both powerful and very light, and these engines were used on a variation of many different other motorcycle manufacturers during the late 1970s and early 80s, and even the British-made CCM bikes used a 250 version of this Hyro motor in their 1979 and 1980 bikes. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that the legendary British trials rider Sammy Miller also had a hand in the development of this engine with a view to using this power plant in some of his trials machines. So naturally, because this was a fully Italian built bike, it used locally sourced Italian components, and at the front it was a pair of Marzocchi forks that were used to keep the front end of our Aprilia in check while it was negotiating those bumps and holes on the track. Now, the rear shocks again were Italian bi-tubo suspension units, which, as I remember, were pretty good shocks for that 1980s twin shock period. Now, the bike's rear swing arm was a sand-cast alloy component, and even those original Acront alloy wheels there look like they've just been made fresh at the Aprilia factory. But when you look up at the tailpipe of this exhaust, you can certainly see there's no evidence of any carbon or soot deposits, which also endorses the fact that the engine on this bike has never ever been run. But once more, one of those bikes that you certainly don't see every day, and in this kind of unused and unmolested condition. But whether Terry will ever fire this bike up or maybe use it on a track somewhere is anybody's guess. But it's certainly a very rare item from the 1980s, and in its way a bit of a motorcycle time capsule from back in the day. Although my personal view would just be to keep this bike as it is, because of course once it's used on a racetrack, then it's just another second-hand 80s dirt bike. Okay, so just to conclude this part 2 in our brand new series, let's have a quick look at this nice Spanish 1977 Montero Capra VB 125, and again this was another very rare specimen that I captured at the 2015 Kendall Classic Nostalgia Scramble a few years ago. Now, the question that you have to ask yourself here is how many of these smaller 125 Monteros have you seen still taking part in classic scrambles these days? And in fact, I think I'd never actually come across one until I stumbled upon this cracking example here. But our little Monty certainly had a light tubular steel chassis, and of course these nicely shaped fuel tanks that, as I remember, were made of fiberglass in 1977, which was a few years before plastic was beginning to be used on most off-road motorcycles. Now, the engine on our Montero was just a simple piston port 125 two-stroke that was fueled by a quite sizable Bing carburetor, and basically I'm sure that it was just a scaled down version of the engines that powered its bigger brothers, the 250 and the 414 Capras. Now, they say that Montero brought out these smaller capacity racers to try and tap into the thriving schoolboy racing market, which at that time was quite big business, not only in Spain itself but in the UK also. And it's said that Montero even started up their very own schoolboy racing championship in that year to encourage younger racers to get into the sport, and of course hopefully to get them started on these smaller capacity bikes and then progress through the ranks eventually to buying Montero's larger capacity machines. Now, I'm quite sure that this bike isn't as it was in 1977, and I think it's maybe undergone some kind of restoration at some point in its life, but nevertheless, whoever did the work on this little bike has made a first-class job of its refurbishment and eventual restoration. So with regards to the front forks on our little Montero, to tell you the truth, I don't actually know their make or origins, although they could certainly be a set of Telesco units, which I know were fitted onto some of the earlier Monteros in the 1970s. So switching onto the rear of our 125 Capra VB, we have a pair of Italian-made Marzocchi piggyback rear shocks, which certainly give you the impression that they've maybe been fitted onto the bike upside down, but as I remember, this was the way that these shocks were mounted onto these bikes back in the day. But when you look at them, it does make a bit of sense in terms of if you ever needed to make adjustments or maybe doing other things like maintenance or servicing. Now, I do remember that this bike wasn't raced on the track that weekend, and I can't remember it being offered up for sale on the day either, but there was a concourse competition on the Saturday evening for the best looking original bike, and I do recall that our little Monty here took part in that event, although whether it actually won a prize or not, I'm not too sure. But certainly this is a rare and cracking looking bike, and you can just imagine yourself as a 16 or 17 year old in 1977 being able to sling your leg over one of these little beauties, and you'd probably think at that time that your Christmases had all come early, but then again, it wasn't just the youngsters that used these 125 Capras. Many adults, especially in their native Spain, still got a kick out of riding these smaller capacity off-roaders. And although the UK in 1977 did see its full share of the larger capacity Monteros like the bigger 250s and 414 Capras, the market for these much smaller 125s was a lot less buoyant, especially as this was the time that the Japanese were beginning to flood the UK market with their much cheaper and faster machines. Well, I hope you enjoyed that part 2 in our brand new series, but we're now going to take a short break from looking at our 125s, because next time on CDB TV we'll be taking a look at all of the bikes and all of the racing action from the Westmoreland Club's Helsinki Scramble. So I do hope you'll join me to check that out. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.